So good afternoon. Well, I guess it's good afternoon. It's not virtual, so I don't need to add good evening, good morning, like we are used to these days. My name is Edward Kwakwa. I'm Assistant Director General in charge of Global Challenges and Partnerships, and it's a great pleasure to see you all with us this afternoon. Those with me on the podium will be introduced at different times. So for now, I need not introduce our special address speaker, Ambassador Molokomme, nor our main speaker, Professor Chibale. He will be introduced by the moderator. And since there's no one to introduce the moderator, maybe I should introduce the moderator, Ms. Loretta Asiedu, who is Senior Counsellor, Division for Africa in WIPO. Last but not least, of course, and again, there's no one to introduce Mr. Greg Perry, because I just looked at the program and I see the way the program is structured. Greg gives the closing remarks, the wrap-up, but then that means he isn't introduced by the moderator. So Greg is Assistant Director General at the International Federation for Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations. I always forget whether there is an end between the manufacturers and the associations. And as you may know, this is a joint event by IFPMA and WIPO. And we really appreciate the collaboration from IFPMA, not just from Greg, but also from his other colleagues here with us today. So again, welcome to this very important conversation. And when I say very important conversation, as you know, we are asking a very basic question today. How can we advance innovative medicine discovery in Africa? And the fact that we are discussing such a forward-looking topic today is, in my view, certainly indicative of the fact that we are moving towards a new trajectory of scientific potential on the African continent. And in this context, I believe we need to bring the politics of inclusion into the conversation today. Politics of inclusion for the simple reason there are important implications for society when certain groups of people are left out of intellectual study. In addition, I do believe the role of industry cannot be understated. It cannot be understated in this conversation about health research and innovation. We need to create and strengthen value chains for health innovation to go from discovery to development and deployment of products. And doing so will, of course, ensure that the science reaches the people who need it the most. Indeed, I think it's trite knowledge that technological disruption and advancements in health discovery are revolutionizing the business landscape across the world. And that is why it is important to interface scientific knowledge with intellectual property rights in order to create market incentives for such innovative endeavors to continue. Having said all that, I strongly believe that in Africa, and I'm speaking about Africa, the best placed people to drive this kind of health innovation are Africans themselves. Africans themselves are the best placed to drive this kind of innovation. So thanks to H3D for unlocking the scientific potential of young and budding scientists on the continent, for inspiring hope for the future of modern health innovation in Africa. Now, speaking of H3D, you'll probably wonder, why am I looking to my right? I'm looking to my right because we have an academic giant in our midst today. And I'm referring to no less a person than Professor Kelly Chibale. I had read a lot about Professor Chibale before today. I had never set eyes on him. But earlier this week, I had the rare privilege of meeting him in person. And he and I already agree we have a lot of discussions to go on. Those discussions will not necessarily be in the context of our discussions today. But I won't bore you with the discussions we've agreed we will have. So let me welcome him, but of course the moderator will introduce him more formally. For now, just know Professor Chibale and I have agreed to continue the discussions that we have today, as well as the other discussions we had in mind when we met a few days ago. I certainly personally look forward to hearing Professor Chibale's reflections today on the topic, and I'm looking forward to the rich exchanges with the audience, with you, that will ensue following his presentation. Let me thank you for your attention, but before I stop talking, I would now like to invite Her Excellency Dr. Athalia Molokomme, who is Ambassador and Permanent Representative, Botswana Mission to the UN Office at Geneva, to present us with a special address. I should say I have always known Ambassador Molokomme, not in the intellectual property context, but in the human rights context. As some of you may know, she is in fact a trailblazer in human rights. And I know she's actually abandoned 2 of her ministers who are in Geneva because Botswana is, I think you call it a review in the Committee Against Torture. So she's left them behind to spend a few minutes with us, and for that reason, we are extra appreciative that she's managed to join us today. And so, Ambassador Molokomme, the floor is yours to give us a special address. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that glowing introduction that I guess I'll have to live up to expectations. Just to say that, yes, you know, WIPO is important for me as ambassador, as important as the process we've just been going through. What he said is that we are being reviewed at the moment by one of the UN treaty bodies, the Committee Against Torture, not because we torture people in Botswana, but because we open ourselves for scrutiny by the treaty bodies, and the process can be rather arduous. So, but I did decide that WIPO is equally important. This is one of the organizations I cover, and I'd like to extend my special appreciation to yourself, to the Africa desk, and of course, through the DG, for all the good work that WIPO does for us as missions here, but also for our countries generally. So thank you for inviting me. Our host, WIPO and IFPMA, it's a long acronym. I'm pleased to address all of you seated here as we engage with a topic that is central to progress on our beloved continent, which is Africa. You know, we Africans, we love our continent. We use, you know, words that describe it as if you're talking about a good friend or a parent. And that is another reason, that is what drove me to come this afternoon. We would like to see the advancing the human capacity for health innovation and scientific discovery on our continent moving forward. The context of today's discussion is clearly quite important. There are many unique populations and genetic backgrounds on the African continent. We have a huge continent, as you know. Very diverse, but once again, still very much united culturally and politically. We tend to work as a collective. Let us remember the important role that HIV research, for example, has played to highlight the fact that components in drugs can be harmful for Black populations in sub-Saharan Africa, even when the same drugs are effective for Caucasian populations. This differential impact comes down to the diverse genomic wealth of the African continent. Unfortunately, a lot of discovery science that leads to new drugs and diagnostics have typically excluded people of African origin. This is particularly relevant to Africa because we know that the continent carries a disproportionate share of the global burden of diseases. To name a few: HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, non-tropical diseases, non-communicable diseases, including, most recently, health emergencies. Today, more than ever before, we have to support our people, and especially the young people, in order to build upon this kind of genomic research, including for capacities in research and development, as well as scientific collaborations. This will enable us to move with confidence towards a healthier and a more sustainable future for the continent of Africa and for the world. I was pleased to learn about the incredible strides being made to this end by H3D, which I look forward to hearing more about today. The story of H3D, and specifically the project that Professor Kelly Chibale is running, demonstrates that our continent does indeed have scientific know-how and experience. I would like to specially congratulate you, Prof, for your achievements, for your genius, because you are evidence that there are terrific scientists on the continent, and many of them are making discoveries that can impact patients not only locally, but also globally. So congratulations once again. I'm especially proud that you come from the continent. However, it would be absolutely remiss of me not to mention the multi-layered social, political, and economic burdens that the African continent is faced with in this context. No conversation about advancing innovation can ignore the need to better educate our youth, to alleviate poverty, foster peace and security, and address gender-based inequalities. In addition to these key contextual factors that Africa faces, it is important to highlight the value of some of the intangible, soft qualities like integrity, vision, and leadership that must be enshrined in our young people on the African continent. These are values us as Africans hold dearly. The young people are the new wealth creators of our future. Before I end, let me just say something, just a little, about my country, Botswana. You know, we ambassadors must use every platform to sell our countries. We are currently in the process to operationalize the Health Research Regulation Bill. This is just an example that I'd like to share with you. It lays a strong foundation for an enabling environment in respect to what we are talking about here. We also have an interoperable electronic medical records, EMR, in all the major government hospitals and clinics. Skills development and laboratory capacities are needed for genomic sequencing. Our aspiration is to build strong partnerships and serve as the regional hub for expansion of efforts for genomics research and drugs discovery. So let me end off by saying to all of you that we all have a role to play to feed the broader innovation ecosystem that will create an enabling environment for science to be more inclusive and comprehensive. It is never too early or too late. Start now and work with what you have where you are. This is our motto. I wish you all a fruitful discussion on advancing the landscape for innovative scientific capacity in Africa, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, for those very inspiring words. Distinguished participants, colleagues from IFPMA, the ADG Kwakwa, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you once again to this very important conversation. Now, I am delighted to be moderating this session, particularly because this subject is very close to my heart. In fact, we were all we watched in shock at the way COVID-19 devastated populations worldwide. And so any conversation on innovation that has to deal with discovery of medicines and drugs to combat any disease, not only the pandemic, COVID-19, but any other disease, that tends to devastate populations worldwide, and which brings scientists to their knees in terms of what to find, where to find, what to mitigate all these, the effects of any devastating pandemic. I think any conversation like that should be of particular interest to all of us, and especially so for those of us who work in intellectual property. Now, I am very happy today to be speaking on behalf of many when I say that this conversation needs not only to start here and end here, but it needs to continue. And so I am happy to note that ADG Kwakwa is going to be engaging further with our distinguished speaker. And then this brings me to the introduction of our special keynote speaker. Now, to give more details on his credentials, he is a full professor of organic chemistry at the University of Cape Town. He is also a full member of the UCT Institute of Infectious Disease and Molecular Medicine. And then, amongst all of his credentials, he holds a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry from the University of Cambridge. And he's had a number of stints, postdoctoral stints at the University of Liverpool, the Scripps Research Institute in the USA. He's also a US Fulbright Senior Research Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, he was named by Fortune magazine as one of the world's 50 greatest leaders in 2018. And then he's one of the 100 most influential Africans in 2019. And then in 2021, he was named as one of the 22 Black biotech leaders in honor of Juneteenth in the USA. He was recently named in May as one of the 25 standout voices in African public health by Harvard University's Public Health magazine. His research is in global health, infectious disease drug discovery against malaria, tuberculosis, and antimicrobial resistance. The words are many. So his name is Professor Kelly Chibale, and he is the founder and director of H3D Holistic Drug Discovery and Development Center. He's also chairman and CEO of the H3D Foundation. Now, during his presentation today, he will share with us how African scientists and initiatives driven by African scientists and others are making strides in medical innovation on the continent. Distinguished participants, please join me in welcoming Professor Chibale.
Moderator, I guess in South Africa we like to say, all protocol observed, because you don't know what the protocol is, so you just say, all protocol observed. Really tremendous thanks to all of you. Thank you so much for coming here. Really appreciate your presence. And also sincere thanks to really the ambassador for taking time out of a busy schedule and abandoning our ministers to be with me in this room. Really appreciate that. And of course, gratitude to IFPMA, to Greg and the team, of course, and Edward and the team for really providing me with this opportunity to share with you what we are doing, and to Loretta for that very kind, very generous introduction. This is what I would like to share with you in the next 20 minutes or so. And I think the best place to start is exactly what I think Loretta was alluding to, the impact of COVID, and what are the lessons that we can learn from this pandemic. It's about lessons that we can learn. Secondly, I'm going to share with you some of our efforts to respond, create platforms that will allow us to respond to pandemics, but also create infrastructure that really develops young people, because young people are the future of our continent. And then thirdly, I'm going to share with you how we are expanding the ecosystem and community of this effort across the continent. We can only do this much more effectively if we can benefit from economies of scale. And so the lessons that we've learned in setting up our center, we are now sharing with our colleagues, with our brothers and sisters in other parts of Africa. And then, of course, I will give you an opinion on what we think about intellectual property at H3D, and finish off with some takeaways. Okay, what have we learned from COVID? We've learned many, many lessons. The 6 that I've summarized here are the ones that are very special to me. And the ones highlighted in green are the ones that are going to feature more prominently in my presentation. So there's no question that it's not just African, and of course I'm speaking as an African. We love Africa, as the ambassador says. If you're African, you love Africa. But you don't bring this kind of weather to Geneva. But we love Africa. But the one thing that the COVID has done, of course, is really expose vulnerabilities in our health systems, but also really emphasized the importance of investing in local innovation. We saw the role that African scientists played, very important roles they played during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw the sharing of data. We saw identifying of COVID strains and share the data with the world, even though we were unfortunately punished for being open, which is what science should be. It's about being open. The other lesson that I think COVID has done is put all of us on notice to reevaluate how we go about research and development. It's provided a blueprint of how we can do things quicker and much more efficiently. And of course, underpinning this were unprecedented levels of international cooperation from the public sector as well as the private sector. Significant investments in this. And as Loretta, the moderator, was saying earlier, the critical importance of innovation. If there was no innovation, we would not have seen the vaccines developed in record time. COVID also highlighted the importance of local innovation. Tapping into local innovators is really important because when and if there are supply chain issues, and there's nothing fundamentally wrong with a country prioritizing their citizens, whether it's providing access to vaccines or therapeutics. But importantly also that the local innovators can fill gaps and actually chart homegrown solutions. And of course, the importance of local manufacturing really came to the fore during the pandemic. I can't speak more, and this is just another topic that requires just a dedicated session. Regulatory systems. Even if you got a free vaccine, can access it tomorrow, having an efficient regulatory system is so critically important in ensuring access to the innovation that people need. Skills, I'll come back to this earlier. Skills. I like to use the word skills development, not training, because training is very loose. Skills training. This is the Achilles heel of most of what we're struggling with because we keep losing talent. Many African governments after independence invested, quite rightly, in training their citizens. Today, we're still talking about critical skills shortage. What are we doing wrong? What are the best models to upskill people, attract them to the continent, develop them, and retain them? What are those best models for doing that? Finally, but not least, we saw these unprecedented levels of cooperation. As Edward was saying in his opening remarks, it's about partnerships. Industry is important. Government is important. We all need each other. We're not enemies. We all mean well. We just have to understand where each stakeholder is coming from. So, as I walk you through this presentation, some of these themes will be highlighted repeatedly. So a bit of background, H3D was founded in arguably the most significant year in the history of Africa. It's a year 2010. That's a year when we hosted the Soccer World Cup. So the calendar is now before 2010 or after 2010. And anything that gets established in the year that you host the Soccer World Cup is a big deal. So that's how we got started, and we are going still today. The mission is really important. I think the ambassador made a very critical point about the genetic diversity that is on our continent. So, apart from contributing to a global pipeline of candidates that could be developed into medicines, we're also very much focused on developing tools at the preclinical stage that will result in improved treatment outcomes. What do I mean? As things stand today, there is a very low volume of clinical trials in Africa for a variety of reasons that we can unpack and discuss another time. Because of this low volume of clinical trials, less than 2%, what that means is that the volunteers in all the phases of clinical trials come historically largely from the global north. So, the doses, the dosing regimens are optimized on those people that participate in the clinical trials. And then those innovations, sometimes 5 to 10 years later, they are brought into Africa. So our patients and our clinicians have experiences of those innovations much later. But also, the African perspective in terms of intrinsic factors, our physiology, and as the ambassador said earlier, our genetics is not considered. Secondly, the way that we practice medicine in Africa is not considered. This is not any deliberate intention of anyone. It's a number of factors that we need to evaluate. So, the focus of what we're doing in H3D is to develop tools at the preclinical stage. So on the clinical side of things, we need to increase the number of clinical trials that happen on the African continent. Secondly, we need to increase the number of Africans participating in those trials so that vaccines and therapies are optimized for our populations. But in the discovery stage of the process, we need to develop tools that will allow us to prioritize molecules during their discovery phase based upon their predicted profile in African patients. And finally, it's really about young people, training the next generation of African scientists that can innovate and contribute to a global pipeline of vaccines and therapeutics. What else about H3D? Very quickly, we recently, this year, became one of the 3 centers for global health discovery of Johnson & Johnson. And the specific focus of this center was launched officially on the 25th of April this year in Cape Town, is to focus on these precision antibiotics, those bacteria strains that are responsible for the highest unmet medical need in low and medium-income countries. And I think this is a significant development. When you talk about capacity building, We cannot just stop at capacity building. We have to engage with the capability that we have developed. So this example with J&J, we have been working together with J&J and other partners that you will see on capacity building programs, but now we've gone further to engage with the capability developed in partnership with industry to move things forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is only one of the 3 centers that's been set up by J&J. The first center was established in London last year. We were the second one to be established in April, and last month there was a center launched in Singapore to focus on viruses. This is just a picture of what we work on. Not to bore you with the details here, but we are working in the field of malaria, TB, antimicrobial resistance, COVID-19, and a very strong interface with the academic program to provide avenues and opportunities for young people to work in innovation and get jobs. The top box is the people that are currently supporting us with funding. They range from industry to philanthropic institutions to the government of the Republic of South Africa. Significant support from our government and a high net worth individual. You see in that box, Neville Isdale. Neville was the chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola some years ago. But that's not the reason why I drink Coke. It just happened to be that he was the CEO of Coke. But he really is supporting the research we are actually doing that the ambassador was alluding to work on developing tools that are more appropriate for the African patient population. The message on this busy slide, it's all about partnerships. Partnerships involving academia, industry, government, philanthropic institutions, and high net worth individuals. That's the message on this slide. You can never do it alone. Everything we do has always been in partnerships. And that's a message on this slide that I won't even labor really to make. But the 2 boxes at the bottom are very powerful examples of consortia that involve academic institutions, private industry, working together in pre-competitive drug discovery, sharing expertise, sharing knowledge, sharing resources. And that, I think, is a reflection of the fact that we need this kind of partnership. And industry plays an important role in these partnerships. I won't bore you with the details of this slide. Just 2 points I would like to make on this slide. When we see and think about the reasons why people leave the African continent, young people, I come from Zambia originally. I left Zambia in 1989. I have my own reasons for why I left Zambia and why I'm not back in Zambia. I have been in South Africa for the last 26 years, which has become our home. But there are many reasons why people move, for all sorts of reasons. But one of them is a lack of opportunities. So we have to create that capacity to keep people on the continent. There's no reason to blame people when they move to look for better opportunities for themselves and their families. We have to create the environment and ecosystem that allows people to stay on the continent and to make it attractive for them to stay. So, the top left is just to give you an idea. We started with 5 people in 2011 when we started. And we've grown to 76 people today and still growing. And the vast majority of these have PhDs and MScs. These are direct jobs. I'm not even talking about indirect jobs or induced jobs. Again, we are completely funded from projects with partners. But we're creating jobs, creating the infrastructure. We're providing hope and inspiration to young people to see that there is a future for them. But also through partnerships. And I'm very delighted that my colleague Jeremy Barrows is here from Medicines for Malaria Venture, and my colleagues Thomas Pange and Jutta from Merck. We've worked together on projects that have advanced to different stages of the value chain, including a project we worked on with MMV, our partners, that went into phase 2 human trials. So we have gone through the experience and learnings of what it takes to put something in the clinic. And I have learned from this process that you have to kiss many frogs before you meet the prince. What are we doing to expand the ecosystem? We've learned lessons in Cape Town, but we know that we cannot do this alone. We are small. How do we begin to expand the community and ecosystem in Africa and begin to unlock some of the systemic challenges that have held back innovation on our continent? And this is what we have been doing, and is the reason we have partnered with the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, IFPMA, to work together to really develop skills development models that really result in not only delivering on project goals, but upskill people so that they can get jobs and get experience as they work together. So that's how we started the H3D Foundation, to take forward and scale up the initiatives that were started in the center. And that is what led to the partnership with the IFPMA. This is a summary of where we are. The key message on this slide is African-led. African-led. Now, it doesn't mean that Africa can do it alone. It's partnerships, but it's African-led. That's the most important message. So this program now has been adopted by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a Grand Challenges program. Apart from the Gates Foundation, Medicines for Malaria Venture have been a partner in this as well. And the Science for Africa Foundation working together to really develop talent, using the model that we believe works effectively, which is to work on projects that deliver results and people get the skills when they do that. That we not only deliver on project objectives to discover molecules that enter clinical trials, but also we upskill our scientists. We produce future leaders. Leadership is so important at many levels, not just political leadership. Even scientific leadership is extremely important. The second last section before I finish is what are our views on IP? First of all, why do people secure IP? They can explain for themselves, but this is what we understand IP to be. We heard the story of COVID-19 pandemic affected the entire world. So it was the unmet medical need. So when you have an unmet medical need, you have to innovate. That's the first point. Second point, we believe IP is important. IP is necessary. IP must be respected. IP must be protected because it really is an enabler, not only to provide incentives for investments in research and development, but also to create a robust innovation ecosystem. That's what we believe. What about if you're working on malaria or TB, where you don't really get industry involvement because of the apparent limited commercial returns? Is IP still important? It's a resounding yes. In that case, IP is not just a right, it's a responsibility to the patient. So when you own the IP, you have a responsibility to the patient, to move that IP forward, which means you have to make sure that you know how to move that IP forward. People patent so they can publish in academia. You need to have the know-how on how to move that IP forward. Secondly, you need to have the resources to move that IP forward. And of course, universities cannot do that. We need partnerships. We have to just make sure that we add value to that intellectual property and partner. But importantly, every government, every country must be a country of laws, not a country of men or women or whatever. It must be the rule of law. So it cannot just be free for all. That when there's a product that needs to be produced, there must be control. That's why we have regulators put in place to protect the safety of the citizens. And I think IP contributes to that aspect, allows investors to make sure that there are no issues to progressing that intellectual property forward. That's why IP is important. I'll finish off and really just summarize to you the key messages from what I've been speaking about. Firstly, really the importance of fostering and incentivizing innovation. We saw how innovation played such a critical role in the COVID-19 pandemic. Our motto that has brought us to this point through partnerships is about IP, which is also important to the University of Cape Town, which employs me. We can discuss that another time. Trust. There must be trust, mutual responsibility, mutual interest. But also, it's really important to engage with each other on a business-to-business basis. Secondly, skills. You get a technology transferred to you. It's a new technology. Messenger RNA is a new technology. You have to skill people to absorb that technology. And so, for my continent, with the largest, youngest population, we really have to develop our young people. That is the future. And they are innovators, they are clever, but they need opportunities to be developed further. Finally, but not least, COVID has reminded us of the urgency of innovation. I go back to the first lesson I mentioned earlier. One of the big lessons from COVID is that we need to tap into local innovators, incentivize them to fill the gaps and chart homegrown solutions. And really, this opportunity that we have today to highlight, as I've described to you with H3D, how partnerships have become so critical to us to advance the discovery of innovative medicines in Africa. This is also an opportunity to global pandemic preparedness. And that is the final message. But before I finish off, I am not employed by the City of Cape Town to market Cape Town, but I cannot resist. The focus of this slide is not even on the picture of Table Mountain and the Kirstenbosch Botanic Gardens. It's this African proverb. It's a very famous proverb. African proverbs are the best ever. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I also happen to be a Liverpool Football Club supporter, which is what Edward had an issue with. And we have a motto in Liverpool: you never walk alone. That's what partnerships do as well. So that's Kirstenbosch Botanic Gardens. This is where I work. This is the University of Cape Town, just below the slopes of Table Mountain. This is, you see the rugby fields there. We play rugby. Our blood is green because we play rugby. This is another view of the same campus. And if you come on British Airways or Lufthansa or Swiss Air, it looks like that. Beautiful. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for your patience, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Professor Chibale, and thank you, Her Excellency, the Ambassador. We just wait for her to take her leave. So thank you, Professor Chibale, once again. And distinguished participants, you heard him. He finished off with the takeaways, the 3 takeaways on the importance of fostering innovation, the role of skills development, and how COVID-19 has spotlighted the urgency for innovation. Now, I'd also like to add to that the importance of partnerships in different areas, because you see that from his presentation on the H3D initiative, you saw that the program or the project is being driven by partnerships in different areas, and this is key. And this is also highlighted by the proverb that you just gave, that if you want to go alone, if you want to go far, you go together. And so the importance of being together in partnership is key. I also wanted to add the fact that he had also mentioned that when research is being conducted, and especially for unknown diseases, it is important to conduct an Africa genetic sensitive research to ensure that, all the drugs that come out are able to meet the specificities of the African genetic composition. So now I think I'd want to leave the floor open for discussions, for conversation, for questions and answers. The floor is open. Well, whilst you prepare your questions, I guess I should just probably throw in a question or two for Professor Chibale. I think you have, the H3D initiative has made a lot of strides in the continent in terms of drug discovery. Now, what are some of the most pressing infrastructure challenges in Africa that present a barrier to innovation in R&D?
Thank you very much. So I can list a long list of challenges, but challenges are everywhere you go in the world. The one I'd like to single out is infrastructure. When I talk about infrastructure, I'm not just talking about a physical building. That's probably is the easiest thing to do, to fix. It's systems, and I'll give a practical example. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic as well. Procurement of reagents and chemicals. I'll give an example without naming names or countries. We had a project with our partners, Merck and Medicines for Malaria Venture, where we included partners in other parts of Africa, where there was money for them to procure chemicals. And it was so difficult. It would take them 6 months or longer to get that chemical reagent. That's not how you do business. I mean, in drug discovery, it's decision-making that needs to be made quickly. Even when we decided in Cape Town to purchase those chemicals for them, we found it extremely difficult to get the chemicals past their customs. So when I talk about systems, procurement, reagents, immigration or customs, that you can give something to someone, but it's even difficult to get that thing across the system. So I would say really infrastructural challenges for me represent one of the most significant barriers to innovation. And of course, secondly, it's what I kept talking about earlier. Skills, a critical mass of skills, talent. I cannot overemphasize the need for a critical mass of talent. Those two are my top 2 challenges.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're still waiting to hear from the audience. Yes, let me first give the floor to, yes, sure. Please introduce yourself.
Evan Lee, currently working as an independent consultant, formerly of Eli Lilly, Foundation for Innovative Diagnostics, Management Advisors for Health, and MSH, so diverse background. I have a question for Professor Chibale. Given that most drugs that are being on the market today in Africa are developed in the North, given the genetic diversity, which we were reminded of by the representative from Botswana, what do you see as the role for sort of field evidence, real-world evidence, to validate the existing drugs that are available, and what are the challenges there, and is that also a priority?
Thank you very much. So the question really, if I summarize it, is really along the lines of the genetic variability that we have, the diversity that we have in Africa, and of course, what is the evidence, the real-world evidence for the impact of this genetic diversity on the performance of medicines. I'll give just one practical example for this, and this has come from the clinic. So some of the reasons for the variability in the way that different patient populations respond to medicines, which of course could be unraveled if you did a clinical trial. And I mentioned earlier, we have such a low volume of clinical trials that we don't capture those things. This is the example of the HIV/AIDS drug called efavirenz. So each drug, people working in drug discovery understand that before you test your medicine in clinical trials, you need to identify the enzyme responsible for the metabolism of that drug. That information is important also when you think about selecting combination partners for your medicine. Now, some of these variability we see are really a consequence of genetic differences in the expression and activity of this drug metabolizing enzyme. So the example of efavirenz is one where the enzyme responsible for the metabolism of efavirenz, that enzyme in people of African descent, there is a genetic polymorphism which renders Africans slow metabolizers. And if that drug was tested as it was, largely in another population, and the dose given was for a so-called normal metabolizer, clearly, for the African who is a slow metabolizer, you are overdosing them. So that's a practical, real-world evidence of why it's really important that we increase the number of trials, clinical trials, and the number of Africans participating in those trials. But also in the discovery phase, we really, really front-load this drug metabolism. And we have a program we are calling the African Liver Project, where we are really looking at creating this human repository of African liver tissue that we can genotype and phenotype, and begin to then look at the most commonly used medicines in Africa and see whether they are metabolized in the same way as has been given out.
Thank you. I hope he addressed your question. So I'll give the floor to Mr. Tassembedu, followed by Osi.
Merci bien, Madame la Modératrice.
I can't hear anything. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have got some questions that I would like to pose to Kelly. So I'm Director General for Industrial Property in Burkina Faso. And with regard to what's been said, I note that there is quite weak the weakness of the clinical research in Africa and the participation of Africans in terms of being part of cohorts used for drug trials. And what can we actually do in terms of initiatives to overcome those negative trends, negative for our continent? Second question is, is there a problem?
Ok, donc je vais reprendre.
Merci.
No, I didn't. So could you tell me what did it?
Okay. We have to. On the far side.
This one. just tell me what the question is.
Channel 2 for English.
Je peux reprendre.
May I start again? Shall I start from the beginning? I'm very sorry, says the speaker. So, I thank the professor for that brilliant presentation. As I was saying, I myself have two concerns. The first one is related to the low number of clinical trials carried out on Africans, and what would be the reason behind this low number, and what are the solutions that could be envisaged to make it possible for Africa not only to benefit from a higher number of trials. The speaker can continue. The interpreters can hear the speaker. We're not sure if you can hear us. English is on channel 2.
So maybe we can come back to that after.
You can go. Donc, on va reprendre.
Okay.
Aussi.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Osiona Osini Lama. I just had a question in relation to your talk about the intersection between the work that H3D does and IP rights. I think one thing that you mentioned was that in areas of health that have low commercial viability, so malaria and tuberculosis, there is a responsibility on the IP right holder to move the IP right forward. But how exactly do you envision this responsibility, and how do you ensure that there is innovation on the African continent for diseases and infections that plague mostly the African continent when you have this issue of low commercial viability? So how do we kind of put those two together? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think the question is really around how do we incentivize Africans to work on some of these diseases where there are no commercial returns and where the intellectual property is important as a responsibility. That's exactly why the example that I provided earlier with the partnership that we have with the Medicines for Malaria Venture, it's an example of a product development partnership. So the focus of MMV, the MMV is not an industry, it's not a company, they don't even have their own labs, they are a virtual R&D organization. But it's an example of a public-private partnership focused on developing products where commercial considerations are not the primary driver. And of course, you can see this model of MMV and the other models like that, or depending on the disease area, but malaria is an example I'm using here. Again, it's partnerships. MMV works with academic institutions, MMV works with private industry. The project that we have with colleagues from Merck is a private company, it's an industry. MMV is a not-for-profit virtual R&D organization, and we are an academic institution. And we come together to work together on a disease where the commercial returns are exactly an issue. But still, IP is important. So someone has to do it. So if it's free lunch for me, it's free for me, but somebody pays for it.
Thank you. I think we can give the floor now to Mr. Tassimbedu.
Je peux?
May I? Shall I go ahead? Can you hear me? Good. So, I'm Mamadita Semedo of the National Centre for Intellectual Property, which represents WIPO in Burkina Faso. In passing, I would like to congratulate the professor for the brilliant communication. I have two concerns. The first one is related to the low number of clinical trials, and also the low number of Africans participating in these trials. What is the reason for this? And what do you think could be done to make it easier for more Africans to participate in those trials, to ensure that there are more clinical trials which take account of Africans, and for these trials to be adapted to our bodies, our organisms? And also, there is an incredible potential in traditional knowledge in Africa, and a number of products, in fact, have been created based on that traditional knowledge. So what I would like to know is, what role is played by your entity to make use that there is not excessive exploitation of this traditional knowledge, but yet we can make good use of the transition possibilities between traditional medicines and modern medicines? Do you take action in West Africa, and particularly in Burkina Faso, where there is potential? Have you done something already? Are you planning to do something?
Okay, so I will summarize the three questions. Un, deux, trois. That's my only French. I can count. So the first question was on the low volume of clinical trials in Africa. What are the contributing factors, and what can we do to change that? The second question is on traditional medicines. What are we doing at H3D with traditional medicines? They're an important source, but also, especially in Burkina Faso, have we done anything there? I thought there were three. Or was it just?
I think he also spoke about how to get Africans to participate.
Yes, thank you. So I think there are two broad questions. One around the low volume of clinical trials, why? And then how can we get more Africans to participate? And then the third one is on traditional medicines. So the reasons for the low volume of clinical trials are varied. I'll mention just a few. Firstly, the lack of harmonization of the regulatory environment in Africa, I think, has really made it difficult for, let's say, companies, or anyone for that matter, that wants to do a clinical trial. Especially when you think about doing phase 3 clinical trials, which require to be done in multiple regions, and we collect data from those regions. If you don't have an harmonized regulator, there are going to be issues if each country implements its own systems of doing that. But thankfully, it's very encouraging. We saw just last week Rwanda being selected as the host country for the African Medicines Agency. That's a step in the right direction. But we have some way to go. What I have seen already during my time as a board member of the SAPRA, which is a local regulator in South Africa, is to see harmonization at a regional level. And the one example I remember very well is Zazibona, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia. The regulated in those regions getting together, they will recognize mutually so that you don't have to go through each country for that. So the regulatory environment, secondly, the unpredictable nature of those systems. People don't mind to be told no or yes, but they need to know that this is a process, and If it's going to take 6 months, that's too long for anybody, for that matter. So efficiency is a real problem. The third one, I can go on, but let me just give you the last one in the interest of time, is government policies where, for example, in some countries, before they can approve the product, whether it's a vaccine or a medicine, they want to see data on testing on the local population. But if there's no requirement, why bother? But if there's a policy that requires local clinical trial data, that will force the issue to develop capacity, because you cannot require local data and yet there's no capacity to generate it. So those three, I think, stand out for me. It's just a lack of harmonization. It's encouraging, it's going to happen one day. Lack of efficiency, takes too long. And of course, policy needs to be there. On the question of how can we increase the number of Africans participating in clinical trials, there is a role to play for communication and education. We are learning from each other. One of the reasons we had this misinformation, which is not an African problem, it's a global problem. There are people that are always suspicious. They're always into conspiracy theories. But the education I'm talking about is with our communities. Let me give just one practical example. As a child growing up in the villages in Zambia and the townships in Zambia, I got malaria. Thankfully, the government of the day provided health facilities. I go to the hospital, I take the malaria medicine, I get cured. If that medicine was not there, I would have died, and you wouldn't be listening to me today. So, what I didn't know then, now that I know now that I am in this business, it's two things. One, someone somewhere invested in research and development to find that medicine that cured me. Otherwise, I would have died. Secondly, someone somewhere volunteered to participate in the clinical trial for my benefit. So it's only right that I reciprocate. There are human beings, good human beings, that volunteer in clinical trials. So I think we just need to be able to talk to each other. I think we need to disseminate information. This is exactly why. Even innovation, if you have innovation, it's pointless if there's no access to that innovation. So I think it's in our best interest, all of us collectively, the industry, governments, to speak to our communities so we understand where they're coming from. We understand their concerns, their fears. We are respectful of the traditions. But also we use that as an opportunity to share with them things that they don't know. They just don't know. And I think don't underestimate, for example, the impact of colonialism on people's mindsets. Or if it's South Africa, the impact of apartheid on people, the way they think. So I think education is what we need. And I think that is one way that we can increase the number of Africans participating in the trials. Finally, to your question on traditional medicines, we don't work on traditional medicines in H3D. However, some years ago, I was very privileged to be part of a European Framework 6 program that was led out of Liverpool it was called Anti-Mal. And there was a budget ring-fenced for Africa to participate in this program. And there was a group from Burkina Faso that was successful to join this consortium to work on traditional medicines and trying to find molecules that could be developed for malaria from natural sources. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time, we will pick There was one question in the back. We'll pick one question in the back, and then we'll take one from the front. Thank you. So, lady in black.
Thank you so much for that very enlightening discussion. My name is Charlene Musiza, and I'm a young expert here at WIPO. I think my question, part of it has been addressed when you responded on the IP aspect. Now, the second part of my question revolves around partnerships. You mentioned partnerships and collaboration as key in not only drug discovery, but in clinical trials. And you put a map of the partners that you work with from industry, philanthropic organizations, and government. Now, my question relates to African countries. You said it's African-led, the idea of having Africans working together. Are there any philanthropists from the continent you're working with? Are there any companies from the continent you're working with that support the work around drug discovery and clinical trials in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question is, this is revolving around partnerships and with a focus on philanthropies, so rich people. And the question is, are there African philanthropies supporting the work that we do? No, not at this stage. But I don't know how they use their money. I have no right to ask them to give me some of their money. But at the moment, we don't have any philanthropists who are of African origin invested in this kind of work that we do, but also in many other scientific fields. I think it's a challenge. If we see the examples of high net worth individuals from other countries that are supporting us, I wish that we could see that more from African philanthropists, because science and medicine affect all of us. And it's not just when we talk about health issues. There is also an economic issue to think about. Even the question on clinical trials, for example. Somebody has to fund those clinical trials. Clinical trials create jobs. I just shared with you how we've grown from 5 people to 76 people, real jobs. But we haven't put a drug on the market that's making billions, but in the process of doing the research, we're creating jobs, building the infrastructure. So I think that there needs to be that education as well for people to think about really investing in science, technology, engineering. This is one of the things that we are struggling with in Africa, that COVID also devastated the education systems. And so I think this will be a powerful investment in young people into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is one example. And then on the who do we work with? So one of our biggest supporters of what we do is the government of the Republic of South Africa. A lot of things that we do, when we attract money from partners, that funding is for projects. But there's an infrastructure that we have to maintain. And so we are actually a South African government national platform that is critical, recognized for the implementation of the government's biotechnology strategy. So for that reason, we get a core budget from the government that helps us maintain the infrastructure. Then we can attract projects to work on. So in Africa, I would say the main partner for our programs is the government, but as you may have seen on that busy slide with many partners, we also have a number of academic institutions that we work with in South Africa. We are now going to be partnering with a local company that produces APIs, or active pharmaceutical ingredients, called Chemical Process Technologies, CPT, to think about the manufacturing value chain, which is not just manufacturing of approved marketed drugs. When we worked with Medicines for Malaria Venture or Merck, sometimes we need something to be scaled up. We have to go to China and India because we don't have even small-scale manufacturing to allow us to finish preclinical studies. So those are developing initiatives and partnerships. But again, as we mature, this is what I shared with you earlier, this ecosystem that we are developing with the Gates Foundation, with MMV, which I hope industry partners will join us so that we can really, really benefit from economies of scale to really, really bring more partners into this so that we can support each other, because when we started, we didn't have everything. We tapped into the MMV network for what we didn't have. We only focused on what we could do with what we had. But then over time, we built the infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Professor Chibale. Unfortunately, distinguished participants, I have been signaled that we have run out of our time slot. I know several of you still have many questions to ask, and so please do not hesitate to have a conversation with Professor Chibale just afterwards, because he will still be around for a bit. And those of you who have very pressing questions, who want to really send the questions out there, please send them to Ms. Nadine Hakizimana from the Global Challenges and Partnerships sector, as well as Ms. Pelthia Makato. Please send them to her, and she would be passing them on to the IFPMA colleagues and Professor Chibale for your responses. Now I have the pleasure, distinguished participants, to introduce you to Mr. Greg Perry, Assistant Director General, IFPMA, who will be delivering the closing remarks.
I'll be very brief. First of all, I think I can speak on behalf of myself and all my colleagues at IFPMA. We're honored to work with Professor Kelly and his colleagues. I think we've enjoyed our partnership and learned a lot, and we're honored and love working with Edward and the Africa group. All together, I think, on this, working together to go far, I think, is the principle. What we do with H3D is a number of initiatives that we have related to the African continent. We have an agreement with Yaoundé University on global health education. We have an African Youth Award on innovation, which we launched, and we partnered with WIPO on an event recently on IP Day. We have a Young Africa's Leaders initiative as well with Chatham House. We also are deeply involved in African regulatory harmonization and strengthening, which was mentioned by Kelly as so important, and to other stakeholders, very big supporters of the African Medicines Agency. We're also engaged in the local production debate and initiatives around local production in Africa. And we issued a statement with local producers during the European African Business Forum in February, and we have recently set up a farmer group of local producers together with globals who are operating in Africa to look at how we can advance those principles that we put out at the EABF, which uncovered issues like skills and skills retentions, access to financing, IP, governments, the importance of trade and open commerce, and improving local demand. All the points that you've mentioned, Kelly, not just for innovation, but for manufacturing. But what you've mentioned is the importance of partnership. Partnership is the key. It's based on trust. It's based on commitment. And that's what we're working around today. But I'll finish off in reference to the World Cup of 2010. It was a big year for me. My son was born. My team went into the finals of the Europa Cup, but unfortunately lost. But more than that, of course, the theme then of the music was, "This is time for Africa." Yes. I'll finish there. Thank you.